how do you take something like this little spider here and turn it into a picture like this? Do you need special camera, microscopes? How expensive is it? We're gonna cover all that stuff and more in today's video. By the end of this video, you're gonna know exactly what kind of gear you need to make pictures like that. By the end of the video, I'm even gonna give some recommendations on my favorite gear, so let's jump into it. To do macro photography, you have to overcome some unique challenges, and that does require special gear. So we're gonna look at each of these challenges one by one and how you overcome them. The first challenge with macro photography, no surprise, you have to be very, very close to your subject, like a few inches away most times. A normal lens can't do that. It can't focus that kind of close distance. But luckily, manufacturers make something called a macro lens. All the macro lens means is that it's a lens that has the ability to focus at really close distances. When looking at macro lenses, you'll see that they oftentimes advertise a maximum magnification. This is usually expressed as a number of like 1:1 or 1x or 2x. True macro photography will require a lens that has magnification of at least 1:1. 2x or more is even better. Some lenses are going to come with things like automatic aperture adjustment or even autofocus. Now, these are nice features to have, but if we're being honest, most professional macro photographers don't really use them. Manual focus is the go-to, and it's all that's required in most situations. I'll give some specific lens recommendations at the end of this video. The second challenge is when you're that zoomed in to a subject, there's hardly any available light. So think of it this way, your camera relies on light to form an image. If you're out taking a picture of a field, for example, on a sunny day, there's tons of light and it's super easy to get enough light to get proper exposure on an image. But if you're really zoomed in, taking a picture of a fly, we'll say, how much light do you think is reflecting off of that fly into the lens? Not very much. It's very difficult to expose an image properly without a flash, and that's why most macro photographers are going to use a flash with macro photography. You can really use any type of flash as long as it's strong enough. But for convenience, most macro photographers are going to use a speed light mounted on top of their camera. Now, this doesn't have to be anything fancy. It just has to have a manual mode, and it has to have a low recycle time. If you get a lens with TTL mode, that can be great for single shots, but it's going to hold you back as you start to do some more advanced techniques like focus bracketing. Now, the third challenge to overcome is when we use that flash, it creates really harsh light and makes our subject look terrible. You notice how every time we overcome one of our challenges with a piece of gear, it just creates a new challenge to overcome? Well, I promise this is the last time that's going to happen. So what we need to do is we need to soften the light. So what do I mean by soft light and harsh light? A flash with no diffuser is going to create very strong highlights and abrupt transitions from light to shadow. We call this harsh light. And what we want, and what's more pleasing to look at, is a natural fall off in a slow gradient from the highlighted areas to the shadows. We achieve this by using a diffuser. Now, your choice of diffuser is going to have a huge impact on how good your photos look. There are a ton of videos out there comparing diffusers, so I'm not going to go into that right now, but I will tell you a couple of things about them. One, you should always use a diffuser. Don't even try to take a picture without one. The light's going to be too harsh. It's going to make your photo look terrible. And two, there's no reason to use a poor quality diffuser. Now, poor and cheap don't mean the same thing. There are a ton of do-it-yourself options out there that make really great diffused light. Now, we're going to put all this information into some kit recommendations in a minute, but first we have a very important piece of gear to talk about, the camera. So what kind of camera do you need? Well, as long as your camera has interchangeable lenses and a manual mode, you can use about anything. There are some features that'll make your life a lot easier though, so we'll talk about some of those. First is crop factor or sensor size. You're going to have options of full frame, APS-C, commonly called crop factor, or micro four thirds. In a lot of fields of photography, you want the biggest sensor size you can get, and usually full frame is the way to go. But that's not the case in macro photography. Now, this is because the smaller your sensor is, the more effective zoom it has compared to full frame. So a crop sensor or APS-C camera is going to have 1.6 times effective magnification compared to a full frame camera. A micro four thirds sensor is going to have double the magnification compared to a full frame camera. Now, when we're trying to take pictures of little tiny subjects, you can see how this extra free magnification is really handy. So if macro photography is going to be basically the only type of photography you're going to be doing, or the main type of photography you're going to be doing, you should really try to find a camera that's either micro four thirds or APS-C. Another consideration is the camera's ability to use a high zoom macro lens with autofocus to do something called focus bracketing. We're going to cover focus bracketing in a more advanced video, but to give you a general overview of it, focus bracketing is taking an entire series of images that are focused on different parts of your subject and then combining them all using either something in camera or software after the fact to give your image a deeper depth of field. Now, both these considerations become more important as you start to do more advanced macro photography. There's a reason that most professionals are using the same camera, and that's because it's one of only a couple on the market that takes both these considerations into account. So finally, it's time for some actual gear recommendations. Now, I'm going to break these up into budget levels. You can get good quality photos at any budget level, but I'm not going to lie to you, there are some things that are going to be a lot easier if you have a higher end setup. Do keep in mind though that it's not uncommon to start with a really cheap setup and slowly progress or improve it over time. The lowest budget level, we have a baseline DSLR, something like the Canon EOS Rebel. With that, you would use the kit lens, you would use some extension tubes, and you would use something called the Raynox DCR-250 magnifier. I'll cover extension tubes and the Raynox magnifier in a later video, but essentially they're just things that go before and after your lens that increase the magnification. Now at the mid-tier, we have something like the Sony A6000. You pair this with a Laowa 100mm 2x lens, something like the Godox TT350 for flash, and then either the Cygnustech or AK diffuser. You can reduce the price of the mid-tier by either swapping the lens to a pergear 60mm, swapping the diffuser to a homemade do-it-yourself version, or even look at changing the flash from the Godox TT350 to something like the Meike MK320. Now the top tier, we have my favorite setup. This setup is either exactly what your favorite macro photographer is using, or they're using something very, very similar. For the camera, we have the Olympus OM1 with a M.Zuiko 90mm 2x lens, something like the Godox V860 Mark III flash, and either a Cygnustech or AK diffuser. This is the setup that I am personally using currently, as are most professional macro photographers. Now this tier isn't about saving money, but some people are going to want to save some weight. And the main way that people do that is by switching the lens to the 60mm 1x lens and using a Raynox DC-250 on the end of it to make up the magnification. You can also switch out the flash from a Godox V860 Mark III to something like the TT350. That'll cut down on weight quite a bit as well. There you go. You now know everything you need to know to go out and buy your first pieces of macro gear. But what do you need to use for settings? Watch the next video. See you next time.